Remember the 2007-2009 financial crisis? I mean, it was just a truly seismic event.
Absolutely unforgettable.
And a huge part of the fallout, as we know, involved banks just being caught completely flat-footed, holding nowhere near enough reserves for bad loans. They were essentially too little, too late. But here's the fascinating twist we're looking at today. What if the very rules designed to fix that problem, to prevent another crisis, actually introduce new, unexpected challenges?
That's the core question, isn't it?
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're diving deep into some really compelling research, exploring these, well, subtle yet profoundly significant shifts happening in financial accounting.
Yeah.
It might sound a bit dense, maybe a niche topic, but trust me, this is where it gets really interesting for anyone who cares about how banks operate and, ultimately the stability of our whole economy.
That's right. We're looking at a recent study. It's from the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, and it takes this unique approach. It test beds the effects of new global accounting standards for loan loss reserves.
Test beds. Okay.
Yeah, it's not just about technical tweaks. These changes have really far-reaching implications for financial stability, yes, but also for how transparent banks actually are.
Got it. So our mission today is to understand why that old system was so vulnerable, how these two new global standards, one international, one U.S.-based, try to fix things.
Right, ECL and CECL.
Exactly. And crucially, what a really unique laboratory study reveals about their real-world impact. We'll look at everything from, how much money banks set aside to something critical, the comparability of financial statements across different banks.
And why should you, our listener, care about all this? Well, you might not be managing loans day to day.
Probably not.
Oh, probably not. But the health of the banking system, it directly impacts everyone. These rules influence how much credit is out there, how stable the financial system is, and frankly, how easily you can understand a bank's financial health.
So yeah, prepare for maybe some aha moments about why these seemingly small accounting changes can have massive ripple effects. Okay, let's set the stage. Looking back, for over 4 decades, banks largely used what was called the incurred credit loss model, the ICL model. Many listeners might be familiar with it, but can you remind us why it became such a villain in the story of the financial crisis?
Sure. The ICL model, well, its main characteristic was operating on an incurred loss basis.
Okay.
Which meant banks only booked loan losses when there was objective evidence showing a loss was highly probable. Essentially, you waited until the default was almost staring you in the face.
So really late in the game.
Exactly. That delayed recognition was its core flaw. And critically, the estimates, they were based only on past losses and current conditions. There was just no forward-looking component at all.
Huh. So it was kind of like a doctor only diagnosing a serious illness once the patient is already in the emergency room, showing severe symptoms.
Yeah.
And basing that diagnosis only on illnesses they'd personally seen before, completely ignoring any predictive tests or early warning signs.
That's a perfect analogy. It led to banks having insufficient reserves during the good times because, on the surface, everything looked fine.
Right.
But then, boom, an economic downturn hits, and banks were suddenly forced into this rapid buildup of allowances, but only when the losses were about to hit the books.
Which just makes things worse.
Absolutely. It created this pro-cyclical biases. It actually amplified the downturns and increased the volatility of their reported profits. It really was the classic too little, too late, making bad times even tougher.
Okay, so given those, pretty undeniable weaknesses, the big accounting boards stepped in. We've got the IASB internationally and the FASB in the U.S.
Standard setters, yeah.
Their goal, initially, seemed to be a common, flexible, forward-looking model. But then, interestingly, they kind of diverged. They went their separate ways. What did each board come up with?
Right. So to tackle the ICL's problems, the IASB introduced the expected credit loss model, or ECL. That was in 2014, effective early 2018.
ECL, got it.
It uses what they call a dual measurement approach. So banks primarily estimate expected losses for the next 12 months, unless, and this is key, unless there's been a significant deterioration in that loan's credit quality. If that happens, then they have to switch gears and recognize expected losses for the loan's entire remaining lifetime.
Okay, significant deterioration. That sounds like... it sounds like a judgment call. That leaves some room for interpretation for managerial discretion, right?
It absolutely does. And that little phrase becomes really important when we talk about comparability later on.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the international ECL. What about the U.S.?
Meanwhile, the FASB in the U.S. issued its current expected credit loss model, or CECL. That was 2016, effective 2020.
The ECL.
And this one's different. It's a single measurement approach. It uniquely requires banks to measure and recognize lifetime expected credit losses right from day one, right at the loan's initiation.
Wow, lifetime losses from day one. That sounds like a much bigger, much earlier hit to reserves for the banks, a real front-loading of potential costs.
It is. It's a fundamental shift in timing.
So despite these, different mechanics, the dual versus single measurement, what's the shared philosophy? What's the big idea behind both ECL and CECL?
Well, two main things. First, both completely ditch that probable threshold from the old ICL model.
Right. No more waiting for near certainty.
Exactly. Banks don't wait anymore. And second, critically, they both mandate incorporating all reasonable and supportable forward-looking information into the estimates. You can't just rely on the past anymore.
Okay, so look ahead, be proactive.
That's the goal. The overarching idea is promote higher quality reserves, make sure they're adequate, and importantly, reduce that profit volatility across the business cycle.
And this wasn't just theoretical hope, right? You mentioned early surveys.
Yeah, early anecdotal evidence like surveys from KPMG and Deloitte back then suggested banks themselves expected a pretty substantial increase in allowances. Maybe 10% to 50% system-wide was the range being talked about.
Wow, okay. So a potentially massive change in how much capital is tied up.
A huge shift in outlook, definitely.
So, okay, you've got these significant new rules coming down the pike. The big question for policymakers, for everyone really, was how do you actually know how these rules will play out in the real world before they're fully implemented? And you've got years of actual data.
Right.
This is where that study you mentioned gets really clever, isn't it? The test bedding.
Absolutely. This is the classic challenge, right? Predicting economic consequences ex ante before they happen. So what the researchers did was employ this controlled laboratory test bedding exercise.
Okay.
They basically created a stylized banking environment. They called it the North Atlantic Bank. And they brought in 56 senior university accounting students to act as loan managers.
So, wait, they put students in charge of managing loan portfolios and making these crucial reserve decisions, but under the specific rules of either ECL or CECL, and just watched what happened.
That's exactly it. Each student manager handled 8 different 3-year secured personal loan portfolios. And they did this over a simulated 24-year business cycle, so they experienced both boom years and recession years.
A full cycle. Nice.
And critically, all the managers faced the exact same sequence of loan portfolios. That gives you incredible control, something you just can't get from looking at historical bank data where everything's different.
Right. Isolates the variable.
Precisely. And one more thing. Their compensation in the experiment was linked to net profit. So it directly incentivized them to, manage profits and try to reduce volatility, just like real managers might.
And then they compared the students' decisions with all the judgment and flexibility the new rules allow. They compared that against baseline simulations, where reserves were set rigidly, like no discretion allowed.
Exactly, a sort of risk-neutral ideal baseline.
That sounds like a really smart setup. It lets you see the impact of that human judgment, the interpretation element, doesn't it?
It really does. It lets you measure the deviation from that theoretical ideal. So they then examined 4 key things across these different scenarios: reserve adequacy, comparability across managers, predictability for future write-offs, and profit volatility.
Those became the core metrics.
Yep. For evaluating how these new standards actually perform in practice, or at least in a controlled simulation of practice.
All right, let's get into the core findings then. Because this study, it seems to unearth some surprising trade-offs. It sounds like fixing one problem, the too little, too late, might actually create others. Maybe moving towards too much, too soon, with real implications for stability and transparency.
That's the tension, yes.
Okay, first up, what did the study find about just the overall level of reserves? The desired ending balances, or DEBs.
Okay, well, the good news first, maybe. The lab results absolutely confirm that both ECL and CECL led to significantly higher loan loss reserves compared to the old ICL model.
Good. Check 1 for the standard setters.
Exactly. It aligns directly with their main goal: get more money set aside.
And CECL, the U.S. model, with its lifetime losses from day one approach, that resulted in even higher reserves than the international ECL model.
Correct. CECL pushed the reserve levels up even further. However, and this is where it gets fascinating, the reserves held by the student managers under both ECL and CECL in the lab They were actually lower than what those rigid, risk-neutral baseline simulations predicted.
Lower. So even with the new rules, they didn't set aside as much as the ideal simulations said they should.
That's what the lab showed. It suggests that the flexibility given to managers, even within these stricter standards, led them to hold back a bit, perhaps to manage earnings. They set aside less than the theoretical ideal.
So it seems even with rules designed for prudence, that human element, the discretion, maybe the incentive to optimize current profits, that still plays a role. It can lead managers to maybe not fully maximize reserves.
It appears so. The study even modeled this statistically. It showed that things like past uncovered write-offs, the expected future losses, and even the manager's own measured risk attitude, they all influence the final reserve choices.
Wow.
So that human element is definitely a factor the standards are trying to guide, but maybe can't fully eliminate.
Okay, moving on to the adequacy of those reserves. We want banks to cover their losses, right? Avoid those uncovered write-offs, the nasty surprises. How did the new models do there?
Right, adequacy. They measured this by looking at the ratio of uncovered write-offs to total write-off. And here, both ECL and CECL significantly reduced this proportion compared to ICL.
Good news again.
Definitely fewer nasty surprises under the new regimes. And interestingly, CECL performed even better than ECL on this front, covering a higher proportion of the losses that occurred in the simulation.
Okay, so that sounds like a clear win for the new models, reducing those painful too little, too late moments we saw in the crisis. But what about the flip side? Did they create too much reserve? What about excess adequacy, tying up capital unnecessarily?
Ah, yes. This is exactly where that trade-off really starts to bite. While they did reduce the uncovered write-offs, both new models also significantly increased excessive reserves compared to ICL.
Increased excessive reserves.
Yes. And the CECL model, the US one, led to substantially more excessive reserves than ECL. For instance, in the lab, CECL's excess reserves were around 48% of the write-offs. Compare that to just 15% for ECL and only about 6% for the old ICL model.
48%. That's a huge jump.
It's a massive shift.
So yeah, in a nutshell, it really looks like we might be trading too little too late for too much too soon, especially under CECL. That's a pretty significant change in how banks are potentially managing their capital.
A very different balance, yes.
Okay, now for investors, for analysts, comparability is just huge, right? Being able to compare Bank A's statements to Bank B's. The old ICL model, because it was so rigid, so prescriptive, theoretically it offered perfect comparability. Everyone followed the same steps.
In theory.
So what happened with the new, more flexible models in the lab? Did comparability suffer?
It did. The study found that comparability, as measured by the dispersion of reserve levels across managers facing the same loans, it definitely deteriorated under both ECL and CECL relative to ICL.
As expected, maybe, given the flexibility.
It was anticipated, yes. The flexibility introduces room for differences. However, here's another fascinating twist. CECL actually resulted in more comparable reserves across the managers than ECL did.
Wait, hang on. CECL, which had more excessive reserves, was more comparable than ECL. That feels counterintuitive. Why would that be?
It does seem odd at first glance, right? But the key lies in that specific feature of ECL we talked about earlier, this significant deterioration threshold.
Ah, the judgment call.
Exactly. That creates the subjective trigger point. When does a manager decide to switch from 12-month to lifetime losses? One manager might pull that trigger sooner than another, leading to wider variations in reserves for the same loan portfolio.
I see.
CECL, on the other hand, mandates lifetime losses from day one for all loans. It removes that specific point of discretion that triggered judgment. So even though there's still flexibility in how you estimate those lifetime losses, the requirement to do it from the start leads to more consistent decisions across different managers compared to ECL.
That's a really crucial nuance. Removing one specific judgment point made the overall outcome more consistent, even if the reserve levels themselves were higher or potentially excessive.
Precisely.
Okay, let's talk predictability. Can a bank's current reserve levels actually tell us how many loans are likely to go bad in the near future? This is about forecasting, right? How did the new models do here, especially given they're meant to be forward-looking?
Yeah, predictability of future write-offs. The lab results here were perhaps surprising. ECL led to a modest increase in predictability over ICL, but it wasn't statistically significant. So maybe a slight improvement, maybe not.
Okay.
But CECL, quite strikingly, showed a significant decline in predictability compared to ICL.
A decline.
Yeah.
So CECL, which demands these big, front-loaded lifetime expected loss estimates, it was actually worse at predicting the actual write-offs coming in the near term than the old backward-looking ICL model. How does that work?
It seems counterintuitive, I know, but it likely links straight back to those excessive reserves we just discussed under CECL.
There's too much too soon.
Exactly. If you are consistently setting aside a very large amount too much too soon to cover potential losses over the entire life of a loan portfolio, those large reserves might not correlate very well with the specific write-offs that are going to happen in the very next period, say the next year.
Right, the signal gets diluted.
Precisely. The reserves are there for this broad long-term potential risk, which weakens their ability to predict the immediate near-term defaults accurately.
Okay, that makes sense. Finally then, profit volatility. One of the biggest criticisms of ICL was that it led to these wild swings in bank profits. Smoothing that out was a major goal of the reforms. Did the new models deliver on that promise?
Yes, absolutely. On this front, the results were very clear. Both ECL and CECL models significantly reduced profit volatility compared to ICL. We're talking by at least 35% in the lab simulation.
35%. That's substantial.
It was a very robust and statistically significant finding. It directly supports one of the core aims the standard setters had, creating smoother earnings profiles for banks.
And between the two new models, ECL and CECL, was one noticeably better than the other at reducing volatility?
Interestingly, no. In the laboratory setting, there was no statistically significant difference between ECL and CECL in terms of their impact on profit volatility.
Both worked well there.
Both achieved that desired smoothing effect.
Yeah.
And this was likely influenced, remember, by the compensation scheme in the lab, which rewarded managers for avoiding losses and encouraged stability. But it suggests the forward-looking nature itself, rather than the specific lifetime versus 12-month trigger, was the key driver for reducing volatility.
Okay, so bringing this all together, we've looked at reserve levels, adequacy, comparability, predictability, volatility. What does this laboratory test bedding really tell us about the broader implications? For the financial world, for us, the public, it really sounds like these new standards are, well, a definite mixed bag. Improvements in some areas, but new challenges in others.
That's a fair summary. If we connect the dots to the bigger picture, the study clearly shows these new expected credit loss models affect those desirable reporting properties quite differently.
Yeah.
ECL, the international standard, allows for more manager discretion at that critical, significant deterioration point. And that makes comparability between different institutions potentially more challenging.
Right. Harder to compare apples to apples if managers interpret that trigger differently.
Exactly. Then you have CECL, the U.S. standard. It provides very high reserves, which helps adequacy. And surprisingly, it offers better comparability than ECL because it removes that trigger point discretion. But it sacrifices some predictability of immediate near-term future write-offs, likely due to that broad lifetime focus and the resulting higher reserves.
So for users of financial reports, investors, analysts, regulators, they really need to be aware of these nuances. Exercise caution when comparing statements, especially internationally under ECL, or when trying to gauge short-term risk using CECL statements in the U.S. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all improvement across the board.
Precisely. And that issue of too much too soon, the excess reserves, particularly under CECL, that's not just an accounting curiosity. It's a real potential policy concern.
How so?
Well, if banks are forced to hold excessively high reserves, it could impair their regulatory capital buffer. That might, in turn, lead them to reduce lending to conserve capital.
Credit crunch effect.
Potentially, yes, which could have adverse effects on the overall economy by stifling the very credit availability needed for growth. It's a delicate balance.
And just to reiterate, while this study used a simplified environment, it still offers these incredibly valuable ex-ante insights, right? Insights before the full real-world impact is clear. It helps us understand the potential consequences long before we have years and years of actual market data.
Exactly. It's like getting a peek into the future, highlighting the potential trade-offs and challenges regulators and market participants need to watch out for as these standards continue to roll out and bed in.
Well, there you have it. You just got a really deep dive into the fascinating and honestly quite complex world of bank loan loss reserves. We saw how that old ICL model with its too little, too late approach was just, well, a recipe for disaster in the financial crisis.
Clearly inadequate.
And how the new ECL and CECL models aim to fix things, making banks much more proactive, forcing them to look ahead and set aside money for potential bad loans earlier.
We learned that, yes, they generally succeed in boosting reserve adequacy and they dramatically reduce that profit volatility, which were key goals, but they definitely introduced these notable trade-offs.
Right. Comparability suffers overall compared to the old rigid system, although CECL, maybe surprisingly, seems better than ECL on that specific front.
But then CECL also shows that significant decline in predictability for near-term losses compared to even the old ICL model.
Yeah. The takeaway here, it seems, is that financial stability isn't some simple equation you could just solve. It's always about balancing different, sometimes competing objectives. And often, solving one problem can reveal or maybe even create another one entirely. It really makes you wonder,
What's the final thought?
are we as an economy fundamentally trading that existential risk of too little too late in bank reserves, the kind that fueled the last crisis, for the very real potential consequence of too much too soon? A consequence that might inadvertently constrain the credit and lending needed to actually fuel economic growth. Something for all of you to mull over next time you see headlines about bank capital or lending standards.
A critical question indeed.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.